Welcome to a special two-part episode of Lucretius Today. This is a podcast dedicated to the poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things, the only complete presentation of Epicurean philosophy left to us from the ancient world. Each week we walk you through the Epicurean text, and we discuss how Epicurean philosophy can apply to you today. If you too find the Epicurean worldview attractive, we invite you to join us in the study of Epicurus at Epicureanfriends.com, where you'll find a discussion thread for each of our podcast episodes and many other topics. Today we're very pleased to bring you an interview with a special guest, Dr. Emily Austin, Professor of Philosophy at Wake Forest University. Dr. Austin is author of the book Living for Pleasure, An Epicurean Guide to Life, which was published in November 2022 by the Oxford University Press as part of its Guides to the Good Life series. Dr. Austin graduated from Hendrix College in Arkansas, and she received her doctorate from Washington University in St. Louis in 2009. Since that time, she's been teaching philosophy at Wake Forest in Winston-Salem, North Carolina. Dr. Austin's book has been getting great reviews, in large part due to her combination of philosophical detail with a friendly and engaging approach. We'll be calling her Emily during most of the podcast, but don't let that informality cause you to underestimate her work. Dr. Austin applies both her academic credentials and her teaching skills to the task of showing how Epicurean philosophy differs sharply from Stoicism, and how it stands for a truly positive approach to life that is not grounded in asceticism, but in the central and uncompromising appreciation of pleasure in the pursuit of happiness. We've broken the interview down into two parts. In this first part, we introduce you to Dr. Austin and to her approach to Epicurus. In part two, we'll dive even deeper into the philosophy that inspired Lucretius to write his poem and our team at Epicureanfriends.com to bring you this podcast. Our normal podcast panel is with us today, and because this is a special episode, let's take a second to introduce each of those. First, a podcaster who has not been with us recently but is back for this special episode, Don from Ohio.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here this morning, and I am very happy to take part in the conversation.
Okay, and we have with us also Calasini from Georgia.
Hi there, I'm glad to be here.
And we have Joshua from Iowa.
Very good morning. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation today.
And Martin, originally from Germany, now from Thailand.
Good morning.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you for being with us today, Dr. Austin. Tell us about yourself.
Yeah, it's great to be here. Thanks, Cassius. I've been looking forward to this for a while. So, like you said, I grew up in Arkansas, in Little Rock, and I majored in philosophy in college, went to graduate school. Actually, I hated graduate school, and I quit for a year. And then I went back and completely changed my interest in philosophy. So I went to graduate school to study 20th century analytic philosophy, and somehow ended up studying ancient Greek philosophy. And like you said, I now live in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and I've lived here for quite a long time. I have recently spent my summer in Wyoming, and I'm hoping to spend summers there in the future, in part because I now have a job as campground host for the National Forest Service at a campground in Wyoming. So I like to say that I split my time between North Carolina and Wyoming.
Well, great. What we're going to be doing today is talking about both Epicurean philosophy in general and your book in particular. And so our format that we'll follow is I'll introduce a topic and Dr. Austin will respond, and then our panelists will make comments and ask follow-up questions. So Dr. Austin, what made you decide to get interested in Epicurean philosophy in the first place? And tell us about the writing of your book, which I see is published by Oxford University Press, part of a series, I understand. So tell us about the background of your book.
Right. So I'm actually, well, at least most of my research has been on Plato historically, and I didn't really know anything about Epicurus until I got to graduate school. The rise in Stoicism has sort of, and kind of the research interest in Hellenistic philosophy in general has made it more common for undergraduates to know some stuff about Stoicism and Epicureanism, but it's not part of the standard undergraduate education. So when I went to graduate school, I didn't know much of anything about Epicurus. And I zeroed in on a research project on Plato and the fear of death. And whenever I would tell people that I work on death in ancient Greek philosophy, they would say, oh, Epicurus. And I thought, no, Plato. But I realized that was something I needed to know. And so I started working on Epicurus and my advisor taught a graduate seminar on it. And I discovered that I really liked Epicurus, and I had an idea about Epicurus on the fear of death. So I started working on that and ended up publishing a paper on Epicurus and death. But then during my pre-tenure years, I wrote almost exclusively on Plato. But after tenure, I taught Hellenistic philosophy class, in part again because people are so interested in Stoicism these days. And so I got to have Epicurus come along for the ride. And there's nothing really quite like teaching something to make you get it. So by that point, I really liked Epicurus, but I didn't have any designs to write a book on him. And actually, I was at a conference with some friends, and they were talking about this Guides to the Good Life series and how sort of novel it was and how they were interested in writing a book for it. And this one woman wanted to write the Skepticism volume, and this guy wanted to write the Plato volume. And then they just said, but who would possibly write the Epicurus volume? No one. And I thought, well, that doesn't, I'm a philosopher, so I needed to contest that. And I started giving this defense of why Epicureanism was really good philosophy for this series. And I found myself so passionate that I wondered whether I should be the one to write the book. And I went back and talked to my students, and I said, well, I'm not sure I should write a book that's too close to an advice book. And they asked why. And I said, because I'm not terribly good at living. It's not like I'm a life coach. But they convinced me to do it. And I approached the editors, and I had to convince them that Epicurus was a suitable philosophy for the volume. But eventually they came around too. And I wrote the book. And it was the most satisfying writing experience that I've had as a philosopher.
Emily, I want to pick up on something you said, which was that this was the book that you most enjoyed writing. I shouldn't say book, but the thing that you wrote that you most enjoyed writing. I think Cassius and Colosini and maybe Martin, we had a conversation with somebody the other day discussing various books pertaining to Epicurean philosophy. And the point that this person made was that he could tell reading your book that you really enjoyed writing it. So it's interesting to see how that comes through in the text. Sometimes you read books on philosophy and the person who's writing the book is bored. The person who's reading the book is bored. One thing I can say about your book, Living for Pleasure, is I don't think anybody's bored. And certainly I wasn't when I read it. It's been very interesting to read it. And, your book only came out in November. So it's interesting to see the way in which, in some ways, it has actually changed the conversation. So I'm happy you enjoyed writing it. I'm happy you wrote it because it's a very good book to read. And it's a book that I'm going to turn to again and again in our interest on this subject.
That's great to hear. It's mainly that I guess it was two reasons. One is that I got to sort of unleash the parts of my prose style that are not welcome in formal writing. So you can't be terribly playful in a philosophy journal article. But also, I think, and this is something I say, I think at the end of the book, it actually helped me a lot to write it because there are a lot of things that I thought, well, that's not a healthy thing to care about in life. But I couldn't exactly explain why. And having to sit down and justify some of Epicurus's claims that I agreed with, but to actually give them, some sort of underlying justification, I found it difficult, but also clarifying for myself. So it wasn't just that it was fun prose-wise, but that it seems a little cliche to say I grew from the experience, but I think that's true.
I totally believe you on that point because my experience in doing this podcast has been I have learned so much more about this subject from having to come up here every week and defend it in front of an invisible audience like we're doing right now. So I totally understand that point. And like I said, I'm just happy you undertook the time and what it took to do it.
And now that we've heard her here and in some of the other interviews that she's done, I'm ready for the audiobook version now.
Oh, me too.
Yeah,
me too.
Somebody asked me about that, and I don't know how that works through Oxford, and I think a lot of people record their own work. And I had thought about that, but I'm still a little terrified of my voice being recorded. I'm getting past that enough that I might be willing to do it. But
yeah, that was me. That was the first question I asked you was, when's the audiobook coming out? Because it's such a great book, and the character of the person writing it really comes through. And so to have it read is a real experience that hopefully I can look forward to one day.
Well, here's one of the themes of what we're going to be discussing for the rest of the podcast today. Presumably, most of the people listening to our podcast are interested in how Epicurean philosophy differs from Stoicism. Dr. Austin's brought up already that there was certainly a lot of argument between the schools in the ancient world, and that argument continues on today. And while we don't want to make this podcast focused entirely on contrasting Stoicism and Epicurean philosophy, probably the most important thing for our listeners to hear would be what Dr. Austin thinks about the major aspects of Epicurean philosophy that distinguish it, and what are some of the most important principles to take away from the question of why someone should want to study Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah, so I mean, that's obviously a big question. So I'll just try to zero in on some stuff that I think does appeal to my students and myself. So one thing about Epicurus is that even more than the Stoics, I think, he thinks philosophy is in the service of living well. And by that, I mean that philosophy is almost useless unless it serves that purpose. So a lot of people think of philosophy as impractical, and Epicurus thinks that if it is impractical, then it's not worth doing. So people should naturally be drawn to taking Epicurus seriously as a contender simply because we all want to live a good life. And Epicurus is a hedonist, which makes him very distinctive in the ancient world because a lot of the arguments of his predecessors either just completely dismissed hedonism as, a life fit for beast, or when they did take hedonism seriously, they marshaled a series of arguments to the effect that, it couldn't be what we aimed at. It had to be either we had to stop thinking about pleasure, or it was always going to be downstream, not what we should focus on. So one thing is that taking Epicurus seriously as a hedonist makes him very distinctive. The later Epicureans chose a series of commitments of Epicureanism to distill into what's called the tetrapharmakos, which is the fourfold remedy. And while I think there's a lot of other stuff that happens in Epicureanism, and taking Epicureanism to just be the justification for these four principles, I think that's sort of a mistake, but they do draw out some big themes in Epicureanism. And so, as you all probably know, but maybe listeners don't, the tetrapharmakos has four components, which is that God presents no fears and death no evils. So those are the first two. And then the good is easy to get or can be gotten, if you focus on it. And then the bad can be endured. So the first two, I think, are actually, in some sense, the most interesting differences between Stoicism and Epicureanism. So when Epicurus says that God presents no fears, some people have mistaken Epicurus to be an atheist, but I think that much like other ancient Greek philosophers, he's just sort of a revisionist. So he thinks that most people have the wrong view of the gods. And so Epicurus has a very controversial view because he thinks that the gods don't play a role in creating the universe. So the universe was not designed by the gods, and the Stoics think it was. And then the gods don't intervene in life either to benefit or to harm or, as they might be interested capriciously. So they don't interact with us. And in fact, actually, Epicurus thinks they don't get invested in us. So they don't really care what we do. That would be beneath them. And so there's a sense in which Epicurus thinks that one of the great fears people have is that they'll suffer the wrath of God either in this life or the next life, perhaps for reasons they don't even understand. And Epicurus wants to get rid of that fear. And obviously, we can talk more about that if you're interested in it. So he has a God that doesn't create the universe, end the universe, or punish or reward people. And that, I think, is very controversial, but I find it pretty compelling because it solves a lot of problems, I think. And then the idea that we shouldn't fear death or death presents no evils, that's another thing that's very central to Epicureanism. And in part, that's from his hedonism. So he thinks that, what hedonism says is that what we want and what we consider good or what is good for us is pleasure, and what is bad for us is pain. And so we have incentive to pursue pleasure, but also to avoid pain. And one of the sources of anxiety, again, is the idea that the gods could be angry at us. But another is that death is the end of our existence. And Epicurus offers a series of arguments to the effect that, that's not bad for us, that death ends our existence is not bad. And so he really, I think, has two main arguments. The first is that non-existence is not bad. And so because it's not bad, we shouldn't fear it. But the other is that it's actually bad for us to wish for an endless life, so that we make a mistake by thinking that our life needs to be very long. And he thinks that the reason is that we'll never be satisfied with what we have if we think we need more. And so if we need another day or another day after that, then this day will never be enough for us. And so I think part of his plan is not just to get rid of our fear of non-existence, but also to have us orient our lives towards satisfaction with what we have rather than that we need more and more of it. So those are the first two. God presents no fears and death no evils. And then the second two are more concerned with the practical philosophy. So the good is easy to get and the bad we can endure. And I think, when people say the good is easy to get, people think like, oh, right, yeah, tell that to the poor working mother. And I think that one thing to know is that for Epicurus, what counts as good, at least at root, is what's necessary for a good life for creatures like us. And he thinks that if we organize our individual and to some extent our community priorities right, then we'll be able to get the necessities. And the necessities are not just food and water and shelter. It's also the sorts of things that give us a sense of security. So things like knowing that you have friends who will be there for you, knowing that you know how to navigate the world and understand it through science. So there's kind of a bigger group of things that are necessary than we think of as bare necessities like food and drink and water. But it's still, Epicurus thinks if we prioritize, we can get those things. And then there are other things Epicurus thinks are good. And they are, fancier versions of those things. They can include various kinds of extravagances. And he thinks those are actually often very available without struggle. They're not necessary, but they are, they really contribute goodness to our lives. But what distinguishes them is that they're not the sorts of things that give you anxiety. And so he thinks that if we prioritize the goods, we can get them. And then the bad is easy to endure. I mean, to some extent, he might be overselling his wares there because really bad things are not easy to endure. But he does think that he has a set of strategies to help people get through bad things. And so one thing that's distinctive about Epicureanism as opposed to Stoicism is that when somebody suffers a grave misfortune in Stoicism, the response is, well, this is part of a universal plan. God set in motion the origins of the universe and God made things good. And so everything that happens in the universe is good. So when your child dies, regardless of whether you understand why God did that, it was a good reason. And when you have a universe like Epicurus's that wasn't designed, it certainly wasn't designed for the good, then you don't find yourself saying, oh, well, these bad things are actually good in a way I don't understand. They're just bad. And so what Epicurus wants to do is to say, those don't get rid of your chances for living a good life. And there are ways that you can handle them. And here I think he has this, what I consider super distinctive view, which is that when we suffer a misfortune, we need friends because that's just something he thinks we need and they help get us through it. But also he thinks that if we live a really pleasant life filled with rich memories, we can sort of dip into that bank of memories to distract us and get through the difficult times. And so he doesn't think it's easy to endure in the sense that it's not bad. He thinks that there are tools that a person who has organized their life well will be able to draw on to get through adversity. And those include friends, but also memories and other kinds of pleasant distractions. So I'm not sure that there are lots of other parts of Epicureanism that are fascinating, like his views on justice and deep into the views on friendship. But I do think that fourfold remedy gives you a map of what makes Epicureanism distinctive. Just the revisionist theology, the conception of death, and the idea that if we prioritize things, we can get what we need and we can endure what's bad.
That is one of the best expositions of the Tetrapharmakos I think I've ever heard. So thank you very much for that. I do also appreciate the way you formulated the first and second lines of those, because I've often seen them given as almost commandments in some translations where it's like, don't fear God, don't worry about death. And to me, I've never seen that in the texts themselves. It's more, to me, observations of how things are as opposed to commandments. And I think that you've done a great job in paraphrasing those and translating those in a much more accurate and approachable way. So thank you very much.
Yeah, sure.
Dr. Austin, as you started your answer there, what objections many people make, they'll agree with almost every item that you've listed in practical terms as sounding like a good idea. But in the end, they just cannot live with the idea that pleasure can be an accurate or full description of what ought to be the goal of life. How would you deal with this question of ultimately, can pleasure really be the foundation of what life is all about?
I go back and forth about this. Part of me just thinks that for Epicurus, we are animals. And the way that we get to know the world is through our five senses, but also our feelings of pleasure and pain. And so in some sense, he would just think, well, that's where everything has to start. And so in some sense, we're just hedonists by nature. So we feel pleasure is good and pain is bad. And that's the way we navigate the world. And so insofar as we figure out what a good life for creatures like us would look like, we're still always going to be doing that through reflection on pleasure and pain. And that makes it sound like he could start from pleasure and pain and then just go way off into like duty and obligation, which I don't think he does. So I do think he thinks that what we fundamentally want is pleasure and what we fundamentally don't want is pain. And the thing that he wants us to be able to do is to reason well about those things. And so at least as far as if other people say, oh, well, pleasure just can't be all there is. And I think something like, well, describe to me your good life. And I don't think people can do it without thinking of all of those things as contributing to a rich human life. Now, some people will say, oh, but I just really love pain. And I find that super weird. And that comes out more when people say, Epicurus is opposed to ambition, or Epicurus is opposed to, CrossFit or something. So I think that oddly, what people object to is not so much that pleasure is good. They just really think that a lot of the things that cause pain are good. And so they think, well, surely I can't, avoid these things like ambition. And so pain is part of the human existence. So sometimes I don't think they think it's about duty. They just think pain is good.
I think that you raise a good point there, because even in that, it seems to me, if people were going to make those kinds of arguments, that if they're saying, I love the pain of a hard 5K run or, marathon or whatever it is. But if you dig down, they're still, it seems to me at least, taking pleasure in the fact that they're completing the run, that they're doing something that they find challenging, and they're taking pleasure in that. So even at the root of that, it seems there's still a hint of pleasure in there.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think Epicurus is a psychological hedonist, which just essentially means that when we pursue things, we are pursuing pleasure. So I don't think he thinks, if someone says, oh, no, I don't do a marathon for pleasure, I do it for a sense of obligation or something. I think Epicurus would say something like, well, that's what you think you're doing it for, but you're really doing it for pleasure. But I think even if it weren't the case that we just, all our actions are aimed at pleasure, whether we agree with that or not, I think that that is a good example of where if you ask someone, why do you do it, it would eventually end in pleasure. So I think a lot of it is just, I don't know. Sometimes I think it's just that the culture is so opposed to pleasure that you have to convince people that they themselves are not really, upon reflection, opposed to pleasure.
Oh, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Exactly. I think it's definitely a cultural thing. Thank you, Puritans, for establishing what we call American culture. But yeah, I think that's a lot of it. Yeah, definitely.
Those people were weird. I did a lot of study of the Puritans. And in fact, they were the people who got me interested in death, because I took a history of death in America course in college. And it was the most fascinating class I took in college. And so when I went to graduate school, I was already kind of primed to be thinking about death related things. But the Puritans had the weirdest views about death of anybody I've ever run into, which is a topic for another day. But yes, the fact that they launched our culture explains a lot of our dysfunction.
Agreed.
It's interesting that one of the early English translations of Lucretius comes from a very interesting Puritan woman named Lucy Hutchinson, a poem which she did not publish, would not allow to be published. But she sent it to the Earl of Anglesey with a note attached saying, if this was still in my hands, I would burn it. I disavow every tenet in this poem and regret my wanton dalliance with impious books, I think is how she puts it. So you're right. It is a very interesting movement. You mentioned something a bit ago about how Epicurus could have gone in the direction of obligation and duty, but he didn't. I think there's going to be people, particularly people reading Lucretius, who are going to actually take that as a point of criticism. I'm thinking particularly of this scene that Lucretius paints of himself standing on an eminence looking over the ocean and seeing a dire shipwreck or a battle at sea and seeing all of these people struggling in horrifying pain, torment, people drowning, and thinking to himself, sure glad I'm not out there doing that right now. But you handled this, I think, rather well in your book. So I wanted to give you a chance to maybe go into it a little bit here and hopefully put a better light on it. We've talked about it on the podcast before, but you probably have some insights that we could benefit from.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful passage. And you can tell that Lucretius is really proud of his poetry there. But yeah, I've made my peace with it. But you're right that it sounds amazingly condescending, almost literally, because he's on a cliff looking down on them. But I'm not sure. There are parts of me sometimes that I just want to say something like, well, Lucretius is not always having his best day. Sometimes he's just smug. But I do think that he is criticizing the ways that some of our pernicious desires or counterproductive desires, in the book I call them corrosive desires, can lead us to do things that put us in peril. And so some of those things I think he's describing are things that you wouldn't be in those situations if it weren't for bad desire. So I think even he thinks the people who are subject to shipwreck in that part, they are on a boat because they're traders. So they're off to get riches. So they sail the sea to get money. And that's a very risky venture. And so here they are about to be shipwrecked because of their greed. And I think he thinks the same thing explains war. And so the people who are in battle are there not necessarily because they themselves are greedy. Perhaps they were conscripted or forced into the war, but because human beings are greedy for power or land. And so there is a sense in which I can see how he thinks like these are the things that result when people give rein to their corrosive desires. But I do think that there's a certain condescension in that because, I think that for me, the point of Epicureanism is not to become a sage or a saint. I don't think that's really possible. And so there's a sense in which I think that's not a good way to convert people to say, hey, you guys are all idiots and I'm kind of mocking you. I think there would be a gentler way to say wars start because of corrosive desires and shipwrecks are often the result of greed.
Yeah, I kind of agree with you. I think we could probably give Lucretius the benefit of the doubt here by saying he doesn't see himself as being in an ivory tower in this case. He wants everyone on that cliff. And he's trying to do that through his poem, but not everyone's going to get up there, would be a way to put it.
Yeah, my father, whenever he would tell a joke that didn't land, something entirely corny, and no one would laugh, he would say they can't all be gems. And so I think that sometimes we just have to give people, maybe it was, he just really wanted to write that passage and maybe he shouldn't have, but it's not reason to give him up.
I've also seen those episodes in Lucretius as a way of making sure that you have gratitude for the situation that you find yourself in, so that you're not necessarily taking schadenfreude from the people that are in the shipwreck, but you are grateful for the situation that you find yourself. And so that's how I've sort of tried to spin it in my own head.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think there are lots of ways to give a charitable read of Epicurus there. And I think there are good reasons to do that. But I do understand why some people read that passage and consider it cruel.
Oh, definitely agree.
Dr. Austin, you've mentioned death several times and the Puritans' view of death. It's always seemed to me that it's an important part of Epicurean philosophy that the reason that you're pursuing living well is that if you know that your life is short and you're not going to be living in heaven in the future, or that you only have one chance, you're going to take life very seriously and make sure you don't waste your time. And with your past study of death, I'm wondering if you see a connection between one's view of death and one's view of Epicurean philosophy.
Yeah, I do. One of the things that didn't occur to me, strangely, well, it did occur to me to some extent, but I didn't think when I started the book that I would write a chapter about the desire for sort of limitless life. If you reject immortality, but you just want to prolong your life as long as possible, I hadn't thought of that as a desire that Epicurus really wanted to get rid of. So I guess the main thing I hadn't realized is that prolonging your life is a corrosive desire for him, or a desire to have more and more. And so I do think that once you realize that the desire that a lot of these CEOs have to live immortally through technology, that Epicurus wouldn't approve of that, and then why he wouldn't, I do think that changes your attitude towards daily living. So although the phrase eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die is associated with Epicurus, he never wrote it as far as we know. But I do think that captures something about Epicureanism, not the idea that you spend your day at some drunken wine party every day, but that there is a sense in which once you realize that this could be your last day, then that kind of resets your priorities. But also, I think the thing that affected me in a certain way, because you might think, this idea that is something like each day needs to be the best day it can be. But I think more for me, I realized that this is enough. So once you get into a mindset where you've organized your life well and you're satisfied, then the next day is sort of like a gift, right? Instead of something you expect. And the joke I tell myself is something like, I've had a good run, and if it ends, then it ends. But this has been really good. And so when you get in that mindset where what you have is satisfying, then it's not like you don't want the next day, but it's really nice when you get it and it's not expected. If that makes any sense. I'm not sure that was the best way to frame it, but it did help me. And it helped me more to think about being satisfied with what I have than any of the arguments about how non-perception or annihilation is not a harm. I think those are good arguments, and I think they distill a certain kind of fear. But to me, the idea is that desiring the future in a certain way is harmful, and that once you stop doing that, you can organize your life in a way to be satisfied.
Yeah, that brought to mind, I did a quick search here as you were talking, the one fragment that goes, "He who needs tomorrow least most gladly greets the coming day." So that's exactly what you were saying.
Yeah, exactly. I was really struck by that. And I mean, I think that's just true. So yeah. It's sort of like, I think Epicurus thinks that living itself, when you're living the Epicurean life, is pleasant. And so the idea that you get to do it more is great. You don't have to do it more, but yeah, the idea that you wake up the next day and you're like, I'm still living a really good life. I think if you didn't expect that makes it more pleasant. And the way that Epicurus thinks everything that is, I don't want to say extravagant, but it's not necessary for your well-being is a hit of pleasure.
Yeah, and I maintained on the forum, too, that Epicurus really encourages us to take pleasure in the everyday things, too, that it's not the big, giant, trips to Rome or life on the beach or something like that, he really wants us to take pleasure in those little everyday things that happen to us as well.
Yeah, I guess I like the as well there, because one of the things that and this is, I think, something that you all are concerned with, and we can talk about more. One of the things I hesitate to do, a lot of people like to take away those like sort of big trips to Rome or these sort of things that we consider in some sense, I think, unfortunately, we consider like overindulgent or something like that, sort of like guilty pleasures almost. Mm-hmm. I think that those are really important to Epicurus. They're just things that are better insofar as they're rare and you can savor them. Mm-hmm. It's not like on your bucket list, like your life will not have been worth it if you don't make it to Rome.
Right.
But I do think that he thinks that all sorts of things can sort of enrich your life. But yeah, I think the main things are the things that are within reach. I mean, one of the things I think I've mentioned to one of you is that I kind of went down a rabbit hole with the novel Lonesome Dove.
Yes.
And one of the reasons I went down the rabbit hole, I mean, I read it actually before this happened, but I noticed in the introduction that Larry McMurtry described the character Gus, who's just a totally lovable character, as an Epicurean and his friend Call as a Stoic. And so I thought, well, to what extent is, what kind of conception of Epicurean is McMurtry working with here? Because he was hyper educated, probably one of the most well-read novelists in American literature at the time. And one of the great lines that Gus has is something like, there's this woman and she wants to go to San Francisco. And he says something like, life in San Francisco is still just life. And that you're better off taking pleasure in smaller things like comfortable beds and tasty food. And of course, because he's trying to seduce her, he says something like feisty gentlemen such as myself. But there is a sense in which what he really does want you to do is focus on the pleasures that are easy and within reach and simple. But I think he does think trips to Rome really do kind of add something or enrich an already good experience, maybe is a better way to say it.
No, I think you're spot on with that. For one thing, you've definitely made me want to go back and read Lonesome Dove again.
It is really funny to do because I did actually, I found myself wanting to write about it. And then I was thought, I'll just go down a rabbit hole. So I did scribble some stuff out. But yeah, it's actually, there's a lot more Epicureanism than you would think. And my thought is that he probably got it from Montaigne, who did write a lot about Epicurus, and McMurtry did a lot of French literature and Shakespearean stuff. So I think that's where he got it, if I were guessing. But there is a lot of Hellenistic philosophy in Lonesome Dove, oddly.
That's great. And the other thing I think, too, you keep using the word enrich, too, and I think that's absolutely right because, I mean, you bring up in the book a lot about that the whole idea is to make those memories that you can rely on in the hard times and when you get older and that sort of thing. And so I think that those little pleasures that the trips to Rome, the trips to the beach, that sort of thing, are those ones that you replay in your mind as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I just use this word enrich, and I'm kind of extemporaneously giving my take on Epicurus. And what I thought was, why didn't I use that word in the book? That would have been a really good word to explain what these natural and unnecessary desires give you, right? Because Epicurus says you don't need them, and that has led some people to think they don't contribute anything. But I do think because you don't need them, I do think that they can enrich an experience without making it the sort of thing that if you die without them, your life has been bad.
You've done a really good job in conveying that, I think, both here and in the book.
I'm going to police myself here, but you mentioned Montaigne, so I have to mention this quote because it kind of ties in with a lot of what we're talking about. He says, "I want death to find me planting my cabbages, heedless of death, and still more unconcerned about the unfinished garden." And that says a lot to me about living for the day and not being concerned about living a long time. Kind of doubles back with something you were talking about a little bit ago.
Yeah, I mean that there's people who know Montaigne a lot better than I do, but I mean, he worked through that a lot. A lot of his writing was to deal with his own fear of death and his grief. And he quoted Lucretius, I think, more than anything else in his text. And he didn't always say, hey, I'm quoting Lucretius, because he wasn't all that good about things like that. But I do think that by the end of his life, he had figured out how to face his own mortality and how to handle grief. And he talks about grief, and he essentially says that the Epicurean approach is better, that he has gained more from distraction. And in that sense, he's a lot like Cicero. So Cicero, of course, hated the Epicureans, but when his daughter died, he went to his friend Atticus's house and said that he was handling his grief by writing about philosophy. And that's about as paradigmatic a distraction as you can get. So I think Montaigne did gain a lot from Epicurus, and he did see that as one of his lifetime projects, was to make his peace with death. And it's kind of nice that he ended up capturing it in that cabbage passage.
Yeah, one thing that many people might not know is that his edition of Lucretius does survive. So if you read French, you can read his marginalia, and a lot of it, I gather, is quite interesting. He received the poem in a way that a lot of people of his time did not.
Yeah, he had a pretty large library, I think, and I would love to look at it. I'm sure, if I did a little bit of internet sleuthing, I might be able to, but my French is not great. I have friends, though. That's one of the nice things about having resources of people who have good French.
One thing I thought was interesting that struck me as you were talking over the last few minutes about the enriching, and you used the phrase guilty pleasure, which is, I think, such an interesting term, having talked about the Puritans here, that's one of those things that sort of wheedled its way into the cultural milieu, so to speak. Even the term guilty pleasure sort of rubs me the wrong way.
Yeah, I don't like it either. But one of the things that I find interesting about the phrase guilty pleasure, one of the ways guilty pleasures comes out that I find fascinating is that people find something pleasant that other people don't find pleasant. Right. So it's sort of like, I have this guilty pleasure of really liking Taylor Swift, right? But none of my friends think Taylor Swift has any artistic merit. And so I have to describe it as like a guilty pleasure. And so I do think there's even a sort of hedonism involved in guilty pleasures.
That's a good point. Oh, I like that. Yeah.
So that's why I think the kind of snobbery imposter syndrome thing comes in, because I think people should own what gives them pleasure. There's a sense where it's sort of like, oh, well, what I need to do is find the same things as other people, pleasing as other people. And then I think there is a guilt that some people have about extravagances that stems from either the sense that they realize rightly that those things are available to them and not to others. And so they're actually expressing a kind of reserve that's admirable. So sort of like you don't go on and on about your trip to Rome with a friend who's financially struggling. But I do think that there is another sense in which, when we do these things, we shouldn't feel bad that we've taken that opportunity that was there for us, right? So you shouldn't be like, I got this weird opportunity to go to Greece for a month and I'd never been. And I went with all these Duke students, which was itself an adventure. But I don't want to have to apologize for the fact that I got an opportunity to go to Greece for 4 weeks when I'd always wanted to go.
Right.
So I think that there's a sense in which there are diplomatic times to mention it or not, but you shouldn't feel bad that good things happen to you.
That's an excellent way to put it. Yeah.
Let me use the guilty pleasure discussion to generalize for just a minute on several things that you've talked about. The issue of sort of intense experiences that we often associate with the word pleasure. Some people see a tension between pleasure versus what they understand Epicurus to be teaching about in terms of tranquility or ataraxia. How do you reconcile the issue of avoidance of pain versus the pursuit of pleasure? In other words, is Epicurus saying that it is so important to avoid pain that you won't do anything ever that leads to pain? You've been discussing contentment as well, not needing to live forever, those kind of issues. How does a person who's trying to understand Epicurus integrate all that into something that they can understand? Once they've been to Rome, should they just be content and never try to go again? And of course, what I'm talking about is sort of an issue of ambition. Can you try to bring all that into a package for us?
Yeah, so I'll start with just this idea of whether Epicurus is really only about tranquility, because there is a very common, I think, misunderstanding. And I mean that it's a misunderstanding even among those people who admire Epicurus. It's not sort of people who are out to mock him and then they set up an easy target. I think there is a sense in which people think that what Epicurus wants is tranquility understood as the lack of anxiety that stems from all sorts of things like ambition or desires about the future. And so they do focus on this idea that really like Epicurus thinks like you should pare down all your desires to this little class of things. And then once they're satisfied, you shouldn't want anything else. And they'll even say that this kind of odd class of desires Epicurus has, he calls them natural and unnecessary. I call them extravagant because there's just no way to write natural and necessary, natural and unnecessary, unnatural and unnecessary over and over again in a book. It would just kill everybody. So I call them extravagant. And there are a certain number of people who think that Epicurus thinks you shouldn't care about extravagances at all. And that's, I think, the ascetic mistake that people make. So they just say he wants the necessary things and then you shouldn't even care about the others. But when I started writing the book, my original working title was Doing Pleasure Right. And so I really wanted pleasure to be in the title of the book. And I love my editor. She's amazing to work with. But when she took the book forward to the Oxford people to decide whether to offer it a contract, she changed the title to something like Feeling Good. And I thought, no, I don't want that. And so she didn't like Doing Pleasure Right for reasons I kind of understand. And so I ended up with Living for Pleasure because I really didn't want pleasure to not be in there. Because I think that one of the mistakes people make is they make Epicurus too much like the other tranquility aiming philosophies. And that takes away what's distinctive about it. So I do think that focusing on tranquility is a mistake because I think there's other stuff in Epicurus. That said, I do think that Epicurus thinks probably the first step that most people need to take is to get rid of anxiety, because I think he thinks we have this vision of what a pleasant life would look like. And often the pleasant life is not a jet setting kind of thing. It's actually, you have this image of like a family sitting down to a table or a certain kind of learning experience or something like that. And then he thinks that there's all this background noise that gets in the way of that. And so we do want to have these rich experiences, but in order to have them, we have to strip out a lot of the things that make those experiences either impossible or kind of mar them. And so I do think he thinks a lot of what we have to do is clear away the anxiety so that then we can prioritize pleasures and choose well among them and savor them. And so I think what people don't realize is getting rid of this background anxiety is just kind of in the service of loving your life and loving the pleasures that you get. And so it's like they stop at that first step. And I think that he thinks all of this anxiety is what's making us prioritize the wrong things and have the wrong feelings. And if we could tackle that, then we would clear up both headspace and time to pursue things that give us the life that technically we want, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think that makes perfect sense. And I think you really did a good job in the book about balancing that tranquility or that freedom from anxiety, both for itself and in the service of being able to enjoy other things. So I think that really came across in the book as a constant theme that I think you really help people see the practical benefits of that.
Yeah, I've been thinking about this a lot, right? So people are so charitable. It's a charitable impulse that makes them say, look, Epicurus is not about, continuous partying. He
Right.
even makes that clear,
He makes
right?
that point,
Not about fish and extravagances, right? And so they lean into that so far in the conception of the impulse of charity that they overcorrect, and they make him sort of like opposed to pleasure.
Yeah.
So I think that in some sense, I understand why people do that, because that's the criticism that's leveled against him, and you want to clear that up. But I think, they don't find that middle ground that I think is clearly evidently there.
I've come around to the idea that he advocates both pleasure that you get internally from tranquility and memories and that sort of thing, but he also endorses those pleasures that come from the outside, from being with friends or going to Rome, since that seems to be the metaphor we've hit upon. But I think that it's just the fact that you're able to have a little bit more control over how you react to things internally if you approach them with that tranquility and freedom from anxiety.
Yeah, and I think that I've never been to Rome. Let me just make that clear. But I actually didn't get a passport until I was 37, which is kind of surprising for an academic. I'm not super cultured. But there are other things about going to Rome that are important for Epicurus. So you shouldn't go to Rome if your mother is sick, right?
Right.
And so there are ways in which you have to think about what matters. And so sometimes those pleasures are okay and sometimes they're not.
Right, exactly.
Thank you, Dr. Austin. That's all the time we have for part one of our interview of Dr. Emily Austin. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast either at EpicureanFriends.com or at any major podcast provider. Look for the second part of our interview in the near future. And in the meantime, please join us at EpicureanFriends.com in our study and pursuit of the philosophy of Epicurus.